All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this new video series. It's an unnamed series, and what we're going to take a look at is how culture now interacts with God's story, and maybe we'll be able to get closer to answering the question if there really is anything truly secular. In this video, we're going to take a look at the 1981 classic Raiders of the Lost Ark, and as we know, adventures are not done alone well. So I'm going to bring in Chris Kline to this party.
Woo! I'm
So
very happy to
welcome,
be here.
my adventurer buddy.
I'm glad I can be your partner, more than you bargained
Right.
for, mayhaps. Until you give me back your $5,000 you owe me, we have to do this podcast. We have to do this stream together. Yeah.
A simple
I'm so excited to talk about this.
$5,000 for 1936. And just so people know what the goal of this kind of video is just start a conversation. I have a belief, and hopefully Chris understands where I'm coming from, is that truly a lot of things in this world that we think are secular are not purely secular. There's a lot of God interaction with this. And at one point in time, we are hoping we can do more up-to-date videos with movies that are coming out. But currently how things are, we are going back to the archives, looking at a great classic, the start of our fedora-wearing buddy, Indiana Jones, in Raiders of the Lost Ark. So first off, Chris, quick, how do you like Raiders of the Lost Ark? What kind of movie is it to you?
This is one of my personal favorites. This is hands down 10 out of 10, A+, objectively fantastic film. Like, I'm the kind of person who has, 5 favorite movies and 25 movies in my top 10 and 50 movies in my top 25 or something like that. But this movie always makes my cut. It is just objectively fantastic. I kind of think, like, as I watched it this time, a rewatch for this, what makes it so awesome. And it's kind of the perfect action movie. The action beats are so well done. The stunt work's incredible. If you look at John Williams' score, there's so many little things it does. Like, I should have clarified with you beforehand. Are we doing spoilers? I mean, I know this movie came out in 1981, and it's not the years, honey, it's the mileage. But I just want to make sure that I don't know if we're going to spoil Raiders Lost Ark for anyone who held out this long. But
I would say if you're watching this video and you've not seen it, you're going to get lost in some of the stuff anyways. So maybe watch the movie first, and then continue this video. So yes, let's say
perfect
spoilers for here on out. And we will try to keep them light, but this is luckily not a movie with the largest twists in the world.
Right. Not so much. So, yeah, I love, like I was saying, that I'll say the chase scene. Once the Nazis have captured the Ark and Indy's getting it back from the truck. I mean, there's so many cool things the score does with this movie, where the music is upbeat and light. Then Indy gets shot in the arm, and the music starts to turn dark. And it's also kind of a perfect action movie. It never misses an opportunity to be entertaining. Like, if you notice the opening scene, it starts with an opening credits, right, where they're listing off the names of different people. But we also get to watch Indy exploring the jungle and kind of analyzing different booby traps when he's looking for the first idol. Or the scene, one of my favorite scenes, it's when they're explaining the staff of Ra and how tall it has to be. That could be the most boring expositional scene. But they decide to add the part where the Nazi agent poisons the date, and Indy's playing with the date the whole time. So you're on the edge of your seat wondering, is Indy going to eat this poisoned date while they're delivering, otherwise just plot information? So I consider this like the perfect action movie. That's one of the reasons I like it. And that's why I wore my Indiana Jones shirt for
nice.
Too. Got it in Disney World in 2005. Figured it's just the time to break it back out.
Awesome. Back when I was only middle-aged, 2005. Well, and let's catch everybody up as a reminder. I know there's been 3. Some people say there's been 4 Indiana Jones movies, depending on how you land on that scale. But let us I know sometimes they get mixed up. So Raiders of the Lost Ark, that is the Ark we are talking about, is the Ark of the Covenant. So as people remember, this movie is the movie that starts with Indy looking for that little golden idol and has the famous boulder chase scene. And we go from there. Yep. To the Himalayas, where he meets a friend. Yes, Karen. Alan plays really Marion.
Friends? Are they ever really friends? They kind of skip from not being so great to being in pretty good terms, just like that. They kind of skip the friend phase, it seems like.
Yeah.
But
where Marion has a certain object he is looking for that kind of kicks off the search and race with the Nazis and a Frenchman. I forget the other bad guy is French in this whole thing.
René Belloc, yeah.
Yeah. And they search for the Ark of the Covenant. And with this kind of video series, like I said, one of the questions that we have is, how does our faith interact with this movie? Now, this movie has a very obvious one, right, with the Ark of the Covenant. And as interesting as that is, I think there are more kind of deeper themes that we can look at. And I've asked Chris to kind of think of one, and I have thought of one too, but we haven't told each other yet what it is. So this is going to be interesting to find out if we have come across the same idea or not. So I will let, unless if you're not comfortable with going first, I will let our guest go first, because I will think of a second one if that's the case that we meet up.
Yes, so we're both opening up our Ark for a reveal at the same time. We don't know what's going to be inside. So I think a really interesting choice in this movie, I think, is who drives the action. And in my mind, I think there's a really cool lesson on God's plan and God's sovereignty that's displayed in it.
Okay.
I said, I kind of said in my review, and you asked, what do you think of this movie? It's the classic action movie. I know you and I are both big James Bond fans. I think James Bond is the classic action hero. So kind of a contrast. If you think about most action movies, right, they're driven by, take like a James Bond movie specifically. Like take Thunderball, right? What's Thunderball about? Largo steals some nuclear weapons. He's holding them hostage. Bond has to foil him. The plot, the entire story, all the action is driven by those two characters, by Largo and by James. Yeah. And Raiders initially is like that. For the first 3/4 of the movie, it's Indy chasing after the Ark and the Nazis trying to chase after the Ark, and they go back and forth, and Belloc makes a move and Indy makes a counter move. But then something really interesting happens, I noticed this time around, kind of trying to watch with a faith-oriented eye.
Sure.
At like the 1:30 marks, like 3/4 through, there's the scene where you see the Ark on the boat, and it's got the Nazi emblem on it. And the Ark gets, and the Nazi emblem gets burned off. The swastika gets burned, right?
Yes.
And no one, you notice, Indy's not in that scene. Belloc's not in that scene. The only people who can see that is the audience. And for the rest of the movie, Indy actually doesn't drive the story. And even Belloc's plan gets foiled. Like the Ark actually drives the story from that point on. That, and Indy ends up on the island, sure, but he can't destroy the Ark in that famous scene where he has the rocket launcher pointed at it. He can't bring himself to do it. He and Marion get captured. And I mean, if this was a James Bond movie, James and Marion would have escaped and defeated the Nazis and stolen the Ark and brought it back to London. But in this movie, the Ark actually it's what Indy doesn't do. The Ark actually takes the cake. God actually, in the form of the Ark, actually saves the day. I think it's a good lesson that even when it seems like we're in control, or like the Nazis, the bad guys are in control, even when you've got a crazy year with coronavirus or an election or whatever you're worried about, it's a good reminder that God's plan ultimately comes true. And even with that, Indy's not fully okay with that in the end. He displays reverence for the Ark. I know it's another theme we can talk about this too. I mean, Indy does choose to look away. It's his inaction that saves him and Marion, not himself. But he wants to look at the Ark himself, right? He wants it to be examined by him and Brody. He wants to go back to the museum. And the American government just says, no, it's going to be looked at by top men. No, you're not going to get to see it. And we don't really get, they don't understand what the Ark is. Indy doesn't really understand it either. But we do know that it was kept out of the Nazis' hands. And if you read into the history, the Ark goes to the United States, and the United States wins World War II. So you can see how God's plan you could argue that it's, the Ark falls into the right hands to defeat the Nazis. But for the last quarter of the movie, there's no action hero or villain driving the plot. The Ark is driving the plot. So
sure,
that was one of my bigger faith takeaways this time around.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that Indy or not, if he wasn't in that last half of the movie or quarter of the movie, the outcome would be the same, except the Ark would probably be lost again instead of taken with Indy, right?
And then would the Nazis have found the Ark again? How would it have gotten back to the United States? I mean, there's, but Indy had to do a lot to get it there too. I'm not arguing he's totally inconsequential, but just for that part, the God saves the day. Indy doesn't save the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love that take, and that's such a good take.
Glad you like it. Hey,
it's interesting because I used the scene that you were talking about with Indiana Jones and famously with the rocket launcher or whatever it is, the Shoulder Mountain thing, where he threatens to blow up the Ark, as where I took my take of this film. And my take is a little bit different. It is sometimes in our life, the Ark of the Covenant is in some ways a literal idol that they're talking about. And it may be a little idol, and it may be a Christian idol. As our faith believes, the Ark of the Covenant does hold a lot of significance in our lives. But my question of this movie, looking at it, is, do we sometimes idolize the Christian things in life in so much
really good
that
point.
they drive us too far or too dangerously in a way that we can go left or right? Partially this comes out of a recent sermon that Andy Stanley just brought out on his podcast, which was great. I actually loved it. Talking about our faith and how there is no more what seems like a middle in anything right now.
Sure.
There is no neutral.
Sure.
I know you're a D&D player. You drop your character. Everybody wants to be like neutral kinetic, right? Or, neutral stuff, because it's kind of a fun place to be, and it is kind of an interesting place to be. But right now, there is none of that. It seems like there, or at least the narrative pushed by a lot of people, is that there is no neutral. There is no middle. And sometimes we drive so hard into our faith that our faith takes the place of that idol. And so that was the kind of the way I was looking at this time.
I love that.
I know if I watch this movie again, that would be a completely another thing I would take away from it. But let's dig in to a little bit more of what you were talking about. And
I had one point on yours, though, that I just wanted to point out, too, though, if we can. I mean, I think Belloc kind of shows that as a character.
Yeah.
Belloc always, interesting contrast with him and Indy. Indy initially does not believe in the Ark, right? He views it as no different than the idol he's chasing.
Right.
In the beginning. He literally, Brody tells him it's like nothing you've gone after before. And he's like, I'm about historical significance, not boogeyman and hocus pocus. But Renee from the start, Belloc from the start, he considers it a radio to God. So he clearly believes that it's possibly divine. But what's interesting is he wants it for his own purposes. He's very adamant that he's like, I need to talk on this to God before I give it to Hitler. And but even he shows up. I mean, he talks in the original Aramaic. He shows up wearing priestly garb.
Yep.
Everything. I doubt he's a descendant of Aaron. If we're going to do some deep Sunday school cuts here,
I don't know if he's a Levite.
And obviously, there's a whole issue with this. They kind of brushed away the fact that the Nazis are totally okay with this, with Yahweh coming out of this thing like that. You would think that they'd have a little bit more pause chasing after a Hebrew artifact, but that's another comment on it aside, I suppose. But it's pretty clear that Belloc's doing it for himself, right? That he's not pursuing it for God. So it kind of, to your point, shows how sometimes Christian things have certain trappings. In that we are, it seems like it may be we're pursuing, we can make idols out of things that otherwise would be seemingly okay because we pursue them for our own purposes, not for God's purposes.
Right. And it's interesting that you brought up that line with Brody, because that was the other line I was looking at when I talked about this. And it is a very interesting, and in this case, I don't want to talk too much deeply about movie making in general, but this is the one exception for this movie I'm going to break.
Go for it.
Because you brought up two things. One, when the Ark is in the crate and the symbol gets burned off, right?
Right.
Also, when Brody's talking to Indy, there is about 2 or 3 seconds where both those things have something interesting, and I think both of them break the fourth wall. That look of the Nazi, that whole emblem getting burned is so in your face that it has to be Steven Spielberg yelling at you through the screen, right?
Right.
And when Brody talks to Indy about following, when Mark, looks at it, he looks directly into the camera almost at one point in time when he's talking about him, when they have that conversation, and it's very intense. It has to be intentional because Indy's up here and he's down here talking to him. And all of a sudden, he kind of looks like this. And then he looks back up to him, and I think that's a little bit of Steven Spielberg tipping his hat, saying, in both these cases, this is where obsession and things can drive us.
Yeah,
just a little bit. I don't know.
Great point. So the placing of Indy being kind of up higher, and out of the frame, you're saying shows that he's kind of outside of where he needs to be because he's too obsessed by it.
Or no, just and that very intentionally. The other character looks toward the camera like he's looking off to the distance, but directly kind of almost at the lens and back up to Indy. He has no reason to do that. So when that happens, normally it's a director saying, hey, pay attention to this for a second.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, like I said, this isn't a let's talk.
No, that might be another podcast. Yeah, that might be another stream. But
it was something I watched and I was like, oh, that's an interesting thing.
Right, right.
So yeah, so my idea is, yeah, talking about this idea of to putting up godly things as an idol and how sometimes that interferes with us. I don't know. I mean, like we were talking about, I sprung this on you. So if you have any thoughts about, life and how sometimes those Christian ideals, feel free to chime in at any time
Yeah,
with that.
I know I have to dwell on it a little bit, but
Yeah, and because I'll explain for me. Sometimes when I've done a lot at the church, I've done a lot of things, and I know that there's a couple times in the Bible where God tells us, especially when we're praying, He actually says to do it not in the public because people will see us as pious when we pray.
right.
And there's a few other times where God kind of, Jesus kind of goes away sometimes to do some of his things, or his early miracles. He heals, but he tells the people he heals, "Hey, don't tell anybody else yet, because it's not my time."
Right.
And where I'm getting at this is sometimes we want to have these big things. We want to say, even in our faith, I am a great Christian. Look at my amazing things. And to prove I'm a great Christian, I am going to do this, and this. I'm going to volunteer everything at Wooddale. I'm going to volunteer not just at my church, but every Christian nonprofit I can find. I'm going to stand on the corners preaching the word of God and tell people I'm hoarse and people are tired of hearing from me. But where does that get us? What does that really get us? What is that us being proud of ourselves and pursuing a goal that isn't there? Or is that us truly living out what God has asked us to do? And I think that's, for me, a great question of life. My assumption is that if people watch this video, they at least have some idea of what faith is. They maybe are a Christian, but, our faith is a spectrum. It is just like Indiana Jones in this movie. It is a journey that we start in a college in California, which I forget is not in England because his best friend has a British accent. I always forget that it starts in California.
Right.
And it's a journey, like Chris, you've alluded to, which in 4 movies, Indy takes his faith actually into a lot of different places. Even in this movie, we see that he really starts off as a non-religious person at all.
He's definitely a skeptic. Very clearly a skeptic. I mean, he laughs and mocks Brody, right, for thinking this is different. Sala mentions it to him as well. He's like, this scares me. It seems like there's something here. Displays no concept or care for it whatsoever. And I also don't think it's a coincidence that also mirrors his views of Marion throughout the movie. He initially views her as totally disposable, and then eventually realizes that she's his his soulmate, right? That she's who he's meant to be, and that coincides with it too. But again, by the end of the movie, he doesn't even need to look at the Ark, right? The Nazis still need to examine the Ark, but Indy looks away. He's accepted it as reverence. Yeah, there's even some interesting points here too that that they use the Bible pretty openly to try to analyze the Ark, and Indy has an understanding of it too. That there's elements of this movie that shows kind of the power of Scripture, because initially throughout the movie there, you could look and see that the Ark is protected by booby traps, like specifically snakes. Why did it have to be snakes? It's snakes, Ask
what did the snakes eat?
You go first.
For 2,000 years, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, how they totally fine. And it's no different than the booby traps that protect the idol in South America at the beginning of the movie. Yeah. But it's eventually revealed again through little hints that eventually overt actions that the Ark is real and different, and it's not like everything else too. So, I think there's a cool scriptural tie in there as well. I love your point about kind of the idea that we get obsessed with the wrong things, even sometimes good things. I know I struggle too with, it's easy to get motivated sometimes to honor God in ways that are public displays. It's easy. Sure. I think sometimes it's easy to want to be seen as a volunteer. And sometimes it's tough to find the discipline to be in the Word every single day, because that's just between you and God most of the time, right? It's like it's easy to want the satisfaction of being in the benefits and the joys of being seen as a devout Christian. But sometimes I think we'd be lying if we don't say that we don't struggle with enjoying the benefits of, say, look at me, I'm involved in church, and I'm
Mhm.
involved in this church, I'm part of this community, and this is great. But sometimes it's difficult to focus on the things that God calls us to do, like praying or being in the Word, that are more difficult to do because it's just you and God.
Yeah. I mean, it's nobody did extra credit in high school, not for it to end up on your final grade, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you're not doing a whole lot. Mhm.
But we forget that in that kind of analogy that the extra credit isn't extra credit; it's just something God asked us to do,
Right.
type deal.
Right.
Um, so I mean that's a tough way of life, is kind of uh, keeping ourselves in check in a lot of
Mhm.
different ways. And you know, this movie, we had Brody be kind of Indy's foil at the beginning of, they talked about it, the journey together and what was going
Right.
to happen.
Mhm.
And even at the end too. And then during the middle part, he had Marion with him,
Mhm.
who very much plays a very strong character against Indy.
Yeah.
I would say she is not, especially for 1981, the kind of damsel in distress, almost the Maltese Falcon of this movie,
Mhm.
kind of the object to push
The
things
fridge
forward.
MacGuffin. Yeah, the fridge who's
Yeah,
stuck. Yeah. Mhm.
to bring in a movie that may or may not exist, a refrigerator. Um,
Well, I meant
yeah,
fridging, that the idea that she's put into that
yeah,
concept. So different than nuking the fridge, but yeah,
yeah, I know.
right.
Oh, yeah, the comic book fridging, which
Mhm.
is something completely different.
Mhm.
Talk about another conversation for another time. Whew.
Next podcast. Next
Yeah,
podcast. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, and we see that in every single one of the Indiana Jones movies. Is it's short round, which another conversation for another time, or Marion again, or Mutt, maybe, if
Right.
that movie that may or may not exist.
Elsa is
Indy,
a really fascinating character in Last Crusade.
yeah, yeah,
There's he has a
you have
lot of
Senior,
foils. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
and where I was going with that a little bit is, you know, I think an honesty with people, having an honesty with somebody to be able to call you out on
Mhm.
your unchecked. I hate to call it pride, because maybe it isn't pride. Maybe it is. Maybe in my world, I try to soften things too much and I don't call it out as it is. Maybe I should just say it's a Christian pride that we have, and and it's a holy pride, but it still is pride,
Yeah.
and it's something that God has asked us not to have. Um, you know, Maybe that's what we should call it. But to have somebody be able to check you on that in life, is if it's a spouse or somebody you went,
Mhm.
did a small group or community group, or a pastor that knows you well, it's important. And
Agreed.
and I think that's kind of my side of what we're talking about here.
Great take. Great take.
Yeah.
Didn't know the pride humility complex would show up for Raiders of the Lost Ark, but what a good connection. That's awesome.
Well, yeah. I told you, I sometimes think a little laterally and a little
Yeah.
differently. That's how my brain works. But let's get
Mhm.
back to yours. So it's been a little
Sure.
second. So for everybody who's kind of watching this, just quick summary again of what your thought was, and let's get back into also yours, because I don't want to leave out your um,
Sure.
angle also.
So let me see if I can remember. I'll try to summarize my take as best I can. That, in my mind, Raiders is the best action movie of all time.
Mhm.
And most action movies are driven by the hero and the villain. The villain has a
Mhm.
scheme, the hero tries to foil it, or vice versa. And the whole movie is punch and counterpunch. And that Raiders initially is that for like the first 2/3, 3/4 of the movie.
Right.
But that from the end of the movie, the Ark is really driving the action. The Ark is what saves the day. Indy doesn't escape and rescue the Ark and rescue Marion and stop the Nazis. It's the Ark that actually comes out, and it's only by displaying reverence for God that Indy even survives that, by closing his eyes to not see the Ark when it's open. So I thought that there's a really powerful message there, that we're not always the ones in control, that bad people aren't always the ones in control. No matter what you think is going on in life, God's always got this, and his plan will always come through, even when you've got maybe the coolest action hero of all time and arguably history's most infamous villains, both chasing after the same goal. Ultimately, even in that, God comes through. That was my takeaway, that it's God's
Yeah.
sovereignty and his plan that comes in.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if we want to look at interesting examples from the movie, I can't think what the guy's name is, but it's like the really bad
Toad?
Nazi that gets his hand burned, right?
Toad? Yeah, Toad is
Yeah,
his name. Yeah.
and
Yeah,
I mean,
nutcist.
yeah, I mean the idea of in some ways that, and this is stretching the analogy a little bit,
Go for
but
it. Yeah.
but you know, in the plan of how to find the idol, there was a set way to do it, and
Right.
we can kind of look at it as God's sovereignty, right? That it had to be the medallion that Marion had, and the other key part was it had to be on that staff, the rod, right?
Right.
And what happens is, spoiler alert for the movie,
1981, people. Yep, you've had time.
1981. So most everybody here wasn't alive watching that movie. Wasn't alive when the movie came out. Was that the Nazis and the French guy only get half of the story, and they miss a key part of it. So,
And what
like
part
I
did
said,
they miss? They miss the part that specifically references God. Take the measurement back to honor God, whose ark it belongs to. Right? That's such a good point.
Yep. And so we have to give back kind of what is God's, what he give back to God, what is his. That's what what I was thinking of. And in the sense in the movie, what that means is the rod has to be, whatever weird length that they were talking about, shorter, some sort of weird thing that doesn't exist anymore. But meaning, so Indiana Jones was able to find the true calling or the true instructions of God and find the true place of the Ark, while the Nazis had to, they were digging in the wrong spot.
Right.
And I mean, I think so many of us dig in the wrong spot in our lives, right? That we miss out on God's, his intentions for us.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, go ahead.
No, that you try to do things on your own terms. That you're, again, that you're not, and again, it's to your point, maybe a bit of a stretch, but actually, no, I mean, it really fits the idea that they only focus on the, again, they only have access to, but the idea that they're not even thinking about the fact that this ark belongs to God. They just want to take it because they're obsessed with the occult. But the fact that Indy's more thorough and consequently sees the entire instructions, which were specifically made to honor God and how they were done. I think it's a really cool point that it's, you can't circumnavigate God's plan. Whatever he wants to have done, you can, kind of like Jonah and the whale, right? You can run and run, but ultimately you're going to go where God wants you to go. Yeah.
And like you're saying, ultimately Indy ends up in that weird island, whatever kind of weird island they take the Ark to
somewhere in the Aegean, right? I wonder what the Greeks thought about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, an island where they set up a movie studio, pretty much.
Right. Yeah, they literally have the film rolling, and
yeah, and either way, God gets us there, or and kind of analogy wise, God, we get there. Both the Nazis, Marion, and Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones get to the island, get to that end spot. So a lot of times, if Indiana Jones was alone, that journey would have been easy to get there, let's say. But, obviously it's an action movie, so it can't be that way. But they end up in the same spot. But then we come to the ending, and I love the ending of this movie.
Fantastic.
It scared me as a kid with the melting of the faces.
Spoiler alert.
That burned a fear in me for some reason when I was a kid, and now when I watched it, I was like, why was I ever worried about this? This is the weirdest thing. But there is this difference of how Indy and Marion survive versus what happens to everybody else.
Right.
And I think you're right about that. And it's kind of looking in this case, literally looking into what was not there or there, what ended up being dust. And like you're saying, the Nazis were pushing this as an occult item, and they wanted it for the power. All they knew is when the Hebrews had the Ark, the Jews had the Ark, they won, and they were successful. And that's all they cared about. And partly the fear of why bringing it back, they wanted to check it before bringing it to the Fuhrer, is because they wanted to make sure they had the right thing, because if they didn't and they were losing, they were probably going to be, eventually for bringing
right.
something back that was wrong. But what's your thought on how do we, as Indy says to Marion, look away, or more important, maybe otherwise say it, kind of shield ourselves from an understanding of not going too far into kind of analogy-wise, looking into the middle of the arc and having nothing there for us to
see.
grow on. Yeah.
I thought about this. Maybe it's because I watched the movie yesterday, which was a Sunday, and it was the same day as Pastor Kyle's sermon. But I thought about it kind of in the same idea of how do you make sure that you're following God's wishes and not kind of differentiating from God's voices and your voices. And I always thought, the best advice, I think this was Pastor Brian taught me this one, was check every impure thought or pure thought, any thought you have against Scripture. And also, if necessary, consult it with disciplined believers. You mentioned, Fransky, the people in your life that will call you out on if you're putting something into a place of too much pride. So I guess in my mind, Harrison Ford at that point in time, Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford, maybe they're the same character. Who knows? Maybe Harrison Ford is Indiana Jones, like for all we know.
He just gets older and more gruff.
Mark Hamill does a fantastic Harrison Ford impression, by the way.
I've heard.
Yeah, it's so funny
great.
that Mark can do. Yeah, it's so good, so on point. But I think that you could maybe point to Mary in that case. At that point in time, she and Indy have built a pretty good relationship. Marion listens to Indy about closing her eyes and going along with the flow on it too. You could kind of say that they're sort of displaying that reverence for it by, yes, they don't have Scripture to necessarily consult, but they do believe that it's the Ark, and they're trusting each other that they're not to look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I agree. And as we kind of wrap this up, I think the interesting part where both of our takes kind of meet is this thought of kind of listening and understanding what God's calling truly is for us. And I think that and both ideas, not doing life alone.
Yeah.
Our faith life alone. And, every superhero has a sidekick. And really in life, we need more than just sidekicks.
Yeah.
We need adventure buddies. We need co-stars, not sidekicks, right? We don't
need a partner. You need a Brody to help you stay anchored with the museum and the university. Yeah, for sure.
We don't need Fransky featuring Chris. That's always the weirdest thing for me in when I watch a movie is featuring somebody else. No, let's make somebody a co-star. Let's make somebody part of our lives. And so
what a great takeaway. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's my hope is that, in life, through a silly example of Raiders of the Lost Ark, maybe we have seen a little bit of the importance of listening to God's calling for our life and what truly he has to say for us.
Yeah, and somebody who will tell you to shut the eyes.
Yeah, exactly.
And having somebody with us. Not look into the Ark. Yeah.
Yeah.
And somebody who, to that point too, if you view it as, Indy still doesn't quite get what the Ark is, right? He's not okay with it going to the top men. But Marion's right there to grab him by the arm and say, hey, come on, like focus on. It's pretty clear, like she's meant to be a soulmate. And he's learned that lesson throughout the movie. And obviously, they ultimately end up together, even though they don't end up together in the next movie. But still, I think for purposes of this self-contained movie, they end up he knows he's her soulmate. And ultimately, the whole saga, true too. But I think there's a good lesson there. I love that takeaway from Fransky. That's awesome.
Yeah. And in 2 movies from now, in movie talk, I think the button even gets sewn on better to that example with another great find of the cup. But like I said, another story, another time. But there is a continuation. This is only the beginning of Indiana Jones' story, and hopefully only the beginning of what we're doing here with these videos. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining me. We're going to have you on many times. I hope everybody else likes what we're doing here. Find us. We're easy to find at Wooddale or just in life or out and about. Tell us what you think. Well, we can take it. And we will see everyone later. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.